Well, according to Catholic apologetics, apparently the word until can be used in situations where absolutely nothing changes. Hello, good people. It is Todd Shannon, data scientist, social commentator, and getter of buckets. And today, I'm back on my interactions with Catholic apologetics. And I came across a video where Trent Horn was attempting to defend Mary's supposed perpetual virginity. And I'll have to be honest with you, this kind of argument and this kind of approach with Catholic apologetics to me perfectly encapsulates everything that I find problematic about Catholic apologetics, because I'll be frank with you, the word gaslighting comes to mind. And the whole concept of gaslighting is when you see something and you know that you are confident in what you're seeing, but they are insisting that you aren't seeing what you're seeing, and matter of fact insisting that it is clear and obvious that you should be seeing exactly opposite of what you're actually perceiving. And that's kind of, in my view, the classic definition of gaslighting. And the reason why this is relevant is because Matthew 1:25 makes it pretty clear that Joseph and Mary were married and that Mary and Joseph had relations after Jesus was born. It's in my view, it is not possible, given the normal use of language and common sense, to see it as anything other than that. But since the Catholic Church has staked its whole reputation and essentially the entire Catholic system would come crumbling to a screeching halt. That's a turn of phrase that doesn't make any sense. But you get the point that I'm making, is that the Catholic Church has invested so much into this doctrine and dogmatically and infallibly, ruling that this is something you have to believe or you're excommunicated from the church, that they have to defend it no matter how irrational their arguments tend to be. So I know that's harsh language, and I know if you're Catholic, you probably come into this and said, who's this idiot trying to throw dirt on my church? Well, if you could stick with me here for a bit, I'm going to explain it. So I'm going to bring my guy, Trent Horn, in, and we're going to let him make his argument for Mary's perpetual virginity and why Matthew 1:25 doesn't say what we all seem to perceive it to be saying. Let's get into it.
Protestants often say Mary was not ever virgin because Jesus had brothers, and Matthew 1:25 says Joseph took his wife, quote, but knew her not until she had borne a son, and he called his name Jesus. In response, Catholics usually say the word brother can mean cousin in Greek, and the word until, or in Greek, heos, does not always include a reversal of condition.
All right, so you see that there's kind of two prongs. Let me see if I can adjust my camera here. You see there's kind of two prongs to his main argument, which is that, one, this is about, Jesus' siblings, right? And then two, about the use of the word until in Matthew 1:25. Now, I'm going to be focusing on that second point. I'm not going to, although I think that the standard Protestant positions, and I say standard Protestant, not all Protestants believe this apparently, but the standard answer of Jesus had siblings, I think that's a reasonable argument against Mary's so-called perpetual virginity, but I'm not going to focus on that for this particular video. I'm just going to focus on his exegesis of Matthew 1:25. So let's continue.
Like, for example, in 2 Samuel 6:23, which says, Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to or until the day of her death.
All right. Okay, so here, all right, so let me just let him finish this phrase here, sorry.
But of course, that doesn't mean Michal started having children after her death.
Now I'm going to bring you in close here, because this is where I believe, and I'm going to use this word. I know that it's strong language of gaslighting, right? And I'm not implicating intent. I am not saying that Trent Horn is intentionally deceiving. As I said to you before, the Catholic Church has to take this method of argumentation because the entire Catholic system will crumble if it can be shown that the Pope, who infallibly interpreted or dogmatically declared this doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity to be true, and that's a pillar of the entire Catholic system, is this infallibility of the office of the Pope. There's no way, because the Catholics have so aggressively painted themselves into a corner with that principle. There's no way they can not defend this, right? They cannot try to make at least a good faith argument for why their position is correct. And I think Trent Horn, I don't know how old Trent Horn is. He doesn't look like he's older than me. He's certainly not that old. I think he's just inherited a sort of tradition of argumentation that isn't very rational. So to me, it feels like gaslighting, but I'm not saying this is his intent. All right. So let's get into the issue here. Now, I think it's important that we understand a few things about language, right? Because language is not wooden, right? We use language in ways that aren't always perfectly consistent with the literal meanings of the terms that we are using. And so whenever we have a turn of phrase that isn't semantically equivalent based on the literal definitions of the words, we call those idioms, right? So here's the definition of an idiom: a group of words established by usage as having a meaning or deducible or not deducible from those of the individual words. And they give you a few examples: raining cats and dogs. How about this? Kick the bucket. If you don't understand if you don't understand that turn of phrase, if you're not familiar with that idiom, right, then there's no way you can arrive at the correct conclusion about what that means, which means somebody died, because there's no relationship between the phrase, the literal meaning of the words kick the bucket and someone dying, right? So those are examples. Now, some, like in this case, raining cats and dogs, sometimes the words are actually a little bit more closely related so that you can kind of use some context clues to guess what someone means. And then sometimes you can do that and sometimes you can't. But sometimes the words are so closely related that you can conflate the two things. And I think this is the case of the word until. So let's look at another situation, because with that understanding about idioms, let's understand how the word until is used, because this is the word until is the really rub here with this whole thing. So there are two ways in which the word until is used. One is to denote a change in status after a condition is met, or a reversal of condition. This is the literal definition of the word, right? So we say, I waited until 5 o'clock. Everyone knows what that means. I was waiting, 5 o'clock came, and then I wasn't waiting any longer. I ran until I came to the stop sign. Okay, that means when you came to the stop sign, you stopped running. So there's a reversal in condition, right? I don't need to explain that any further. The second use, though, is what I believe an idiomatic use of the phrase. It's used as an idiom that denotes the end of a period where a change in status is possible. Now, this is the second use of the word until, and we have examples of it, as is the example that he used to make the point he was making about how it doesn't always denote a reversal in condition. So Michael remained childless until the day of her death. He argues, well, that doesn't mean that she had a child after she died. Well, obviously that's true. But the question is, which sense of the use of the word until are we talking about? Are we talking about the literal use, as in the first case, or in the idiomatic use, as in the second case? Okay, I think it's obvious that it's the second case. And here's a few examples. I will love you forever and a day is semantically equivalent to I will love you until I die. So think about that second use, that second phrase. I will love you until I die. What does that mean? That means I'm going to stop loving you after I die. Does the use of the word until in that particular context, is it intended to communicate what happens after the point of time in question, right? Until I die. Is it intended to communicate what happens after you die? The answer is no, right? Because that's a turn of phrase. It's an idiom. It's an idiomatic usage of the word, right? Forever and a day. No one thinks that when you say forever and a day, that means, you take forever and then you add a day. That's not even a coherent concept, right? So here's the thing that has to be understood. In order to validate their interpretation of until in Matthew 125, Catholics have to argue that it is proper and normative. I want to underscore those two words. To use until in cases where literally nothing has changed. So it is my contention that when the term until is used idiomatically, it is denoting the end of a period where the change in status is possible. Obviously, women can't have babies when they're dead, right? Obviously, a person can't, and at least in the current form, they can't love someone after they die, right? They can't do that. So when we use it in that sense, we're denoting that that time period wherein the change in status is possible has come to an end. That's an idiomatic application of the term. And we do this all the time. And we do it without thinking because it's obvious what we mean when we say things like that. So we don't have to go into these technical definitions of what we mean when we say that. But apparently, this is something that has escaped Trent Horn. So Trent's going to give a series of examples that he thinks bolsters his point of view, but it only actually proves to demonstrate the scenario that I have set up here. So let's go back to Trent and let's listen to him further.
And here's what James White says about this response. This is the stock Catholic answer style response. Unfortunately, this is actually a phrase, not a single term, heus who. And there is good reason to believe the phrase rather than just the singular term heos, as is found in the Septuagint of 2 Samuel 6:23, does in fact refer to a point in time where there is a reversal of the preceding condition. And of course, the fact that the normative meaning of the term brothers further establishes the obvious meaning of the New Testament on the matter. I would say this is just the stock early 2000s response to the Catholic Answers response. It mostly comes from Protestant apologist Eric Svensson's 2001 book, Who is My Mother? So let's take a look at what Svensson says about Matthew 125.
Now, before we go any further, this is obviously a much more in-depth exegetical attempt to explain what the proper meaning of the word until in Matthew 125 is, and it entails Greek. The reason why I wanted to take this approach is because, one, I do not read Greek, and I do not understand Greek grammatical structure. I do not understand Greek idioms, but I think I can understand English pretty well, right? And I think that our language is expressive enough to where we have words where we can denote where actually nothing has changed. Like, for example, if we say, hey, at 9:30, I was still eating breakfast, right? So we use the word still, right? That's a word that's in our vocabulary, and we understand what it means. Still means that the condition didn't change at a specific point. And what we want people to understand when we say that is that the condition continued, nor did the time period end, right? So there was no reversal in condition, and nor did the time where I was eating, for example, nor did that come to a halt. So we have words to express the thing that Trent is implying that Matthew 125 is communicating. So the question is should a reasonable person accept that when we have perfectly at our disposal words that communicate clearly the condition that he's implying rather than something that communicates the opposite? Is it plausible in your mind that that's a reasonable explanation to you? At some point, you have to do what my good guy Gavin Ortman likes to say. We have to yield to plausibility, right? That doesn't seem like a reasonable explanation, but let's let Trent continue. Now, there again, I think the Greek explanation is probably a good argument, but I don't know. I don't speak Greek, but let's let him continue.
He writes, the literary evidence suggests that the Greek speaker of Matthew's time would have understood the phrase heus who to imply cessation of action of the main clause after the action of the subordinate clause. In other words, Svensson says that the single Greek word heos can be used in a continuing sense, like in Matthew 28:20 when Jesus says, I am with you always, to, or until, the close of the age.
Now, this is why I'm going to bring you in close again. This is why I wanted to offer this specific argument, because I think that Trent here has a point in pointing out a situation where we have the use of the word until in the Greek, which is, I guess, heus. Hope I'm saying that right. And he brings up Matthew 28, where there is a use of the word where it seems to be like until is being employed in a continual sense. And I think he probably has a point here. And that's why I think that probably the term heus who does imply what he says. But the idea that sometimes the word until can be used in a, quote, continual sense, I reject that. I think the deployment of the word until always denotes a change. And to go back to my presentation here, it is always used in a sense where either there's a reversal in condition or the end of a period has come to a close, right? Or a period has come to a close where that change is possible. And if we go back to Trent's example, we see that this is exactly what Jesus is communicating in Matthew 28, where he says, I am with you always until the close of the age. What changed? The age came to a close. This is an idiomatic deployment of the word until that doesn't imply or doesn't include the term heus uhu. So in my humble opinion, my argument is a bit more robust than the one being offered by the heus who. There again, I'm probably saying that wrong. The Greek argument, right? Because I think that never is the term until used in a continual sense where, I'm going to underscore this, nothing has changed. Okay, let's go back to Trent.
But that does not mean Jesus will reverse and not be with the disciples after the close of the age. However, heus who during Matthew's time, he says, always included a reversal of condition. But here's what's wrong with Svensson's argument. First, it's not clear the New Testament's use of heus who always includes a reversal. In Acts 25:21, Festus tells King Agrippa, when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I commanded him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. If this is referring to Paul's appeals to be kept in Roman custody, then there's no reversal because Paul was perpetually in Roman custody after that point.
Okay, so this example bothers me a lot. And he's going to go through a series of examples that each one of them proving exactly the opposite point of what he thinks he's proving. But this one bothered me a lot because this one is fundamentally different than the other examples he uses because this is just a misrepresentation of that story. Now, if you go to Acts 25 and you read Paul's his interactions with Festus, and basically he's being charged by certain Jewish leaders with a sort of crime, and they say, "Hey, send him to Jerusalem so we can have him tried there." And Paul says, "No," because Paul knew that they wanted to kill him. And Paul says, "No, I appeal to Caesar." Right? And so I deserve to stay here as a Roman citizen and make my appeal to Caesar because he thinks he has a better chance of getting an unbiased trial in Rome. That's why he asked to remain in Rome. Now, what Trent here is implying is that because he ended up being detained indefinitely in Rome, that was somehow his intention to remain in Rome indefinitely. Or that was Festus's basically intent by saying he kept him in Rome, so he retained him until he could put him in front of Caesar. Now, what ended up happening in that whole story is that there was a big thing that happened when they were sailing and they were sending him to Rome. They got on the ship, and the story about them being shipwrecked, and this is, the famous story where, Paul was, they were kind of afloat in the open sea. And so there's a lot of things going on there, but a lot of things happened where he didn't actually get to go before Caesar the way he had intended. And so they ended up detaining him with a Roman guard for a long time. But that wasn't Paul's objective. He didn't want to remain in Rome forever. He wanted to make his case to Caesar so that he could be released. And even after Agrippa came, and Festus talked to King Agrippa, and Agrippa says, "Hey, Or Festus says, hey, you need to listen to this guy because they're trying to charge him with some stuff, and I just want to get your thoughts on it. And Agrippa, after hearing Paul, he said, you know what? If this guy hadn't appealed to Caesar, he could be released right now. So, but Paul obviously didn't know that, right? Paul didn't know that if, Agrippa was going to come, and then Agrippa was going to be like, hey, there's no reason to hold this guy. He hasn't done anything wrong. But because he had already made his appeal to Caesar and they had already granted that, then they were obliged to follow through with that request. So the point is that this is just a total misrepresentation of the story. He's making it seem like Paul was requesting to remain in Roman custody indefinitely when that was never his intent. So this is kind of a bad look on Trent's part. I got to be honest with you. You read Acts 25 through, say, 27, and you tell me if you don't come up with the same story. Leave me a comment in the comment section if you have some thoughts about that. All right, let's go back.
He didn't suddenly stop being in Roman custody after he was sent to Caesar. In fact, he was placed in house arrest when he arrived in Rome.
Again, that was not the objective. His objective was to be freed from custody in general and to exonerate himself from the false claims. Frustrating.
Number 2, Svensson is cherry-picking the data by only restricting his survey to the use of heus hu between a narrow time period, between 100 BC and AD 100.
Okay, so this is also this is kind of a minor point, but it's a lame objection. You understand that verbiage and language and the uses of, particularly with turns of phrase, they change over time. What phrases and what words mean over time matters. So what it meant during that, quote, narrow band of time, which is 200 years from my estimation, that's not a very small period of time. Think about how much slang has changed since you were a kid. Just think about how idioms have changed. We used to say things were bad, and we should say that's cold, and we said that's hot, and all of those things meant the same thing, right? And that's an evolution of language. That's the way language works. It's not wooden. The point is that what is the intended meaning behind the words, and depending on, that's the whole point. That's why idioms are important, because idioms change over time. So this is, to me, kind of not a good argument here.
For example, when we look at the entire Greek Old Testament, we see that 1 out of 10 uses of heus hu does not have a reversal.
Point of fact, anyway, I'll just let that continue.
Since heus hu is used 15 times in the New Testament, we'd expect 1 to 2 of those cases to not include a reversal.
Okay, now this is where I have to put on my data scientist hat, because this is an egregious abuse of statistical probabilities. Anyone who's taken, who is mathematically inclined, which to be a data scientist, you have to understand what's called the law of large numbers, right? And what that means is that when you have a small sample size, there can be all kinds of anomalies that essentially kind of melt away as you move towards infinity, right? So, for example, if you do 8 flips of a coin, you might get heads 6 times, right? It's not likely, but it's possible. That's because you have such a small sample size. But if you flip a coin 1,000 times, there's basically almost no chance that you will get heads 60% of the time. The bigger your sample size, the more the probabilities move towards a true average or a true representation of the data. And the point is that you cannot extrapolate what will happen from a small sample size and apply that to bigger sample sizes. So if you're talking about 15 examples, that just doesn't mean anything. That's such a small sample size that we can't extrapolate or assume that any sort of pattern will follow from the general rate of how these terms are interpreted based on 15 examples. This is silly. Okay, so let's continue.
Like we find in Matthew 1:25, even if that were the only case of this happening in the use of the term. The church fathers also used heus hu in a continual sense.
Now these next examples are going to blow your mind because they're particularly bad.
In the 3rd century, St. Clement of Alexandria wrote, "Thus 30 years were completed until he, Jesus, suffered." But that doesn't mean Jesus kept suffering after he died.
Okay, let's go back to what we've established. Okay? 30 years were completed until he suffered. That's, to me, I kind of was confused by that because I thought Jesus suffered after 33 years, but whatever. But I think what he meant is that at the end of Jesus' life, he suffered. Okay? But what have we established about the two ways in which until is used? One, the actual literal definition, right? Two, the idiomatic deployment where the end of a period where a change of status is possible comes. So basically, one of those two examples has to be in play. And so what is he implying? That, hey, at the end of 30 years or at the end of Jesus' life, he suffered. What came to an end? That was the end of his life. Something changed. The time period that enveloped his life came to an end, and it was punctuated by his suffering. So is he implying, is Trent implying that nothing changed? That nothing came to an end? There was no status in either his suffering or the end of the time period that marked his life? Because that's what he'd have to be saying in order for his point to be valid, and that's obviously not true. Okay, let's see if Trent can try again.
St. John Chrysostom, a native speaker of Greek, says the following about Matthew 1:25. Matthew has here used the word until, not that you should suspect that afterward Joseph did know her, but to inform you that before the birth the virgin was wholly untouched by man. But why then, it may be said, has he used the word until? Because it is common in Scripture that this expression is used without reference to specific limited times. Here are 3 examples.
All right, so let's just look at what he's setting up here. It is the contention of this person who he is quoting to say it is common in Scripture that this expression is used without reference to specific limited times. Now, let's go back to what I said here. In order to validate their interpretation of until in Matthew 1:25, Catholics have to argue that it is proper and normative to use until in cases where literally nothing changes. Let's remember that standard because I think it's a reasonable standard. If you think it's a false standard, let me know why in the comments, but I think that I've set up a reasonable standard. You have to argue that none of those things actually change, neither the status nor the end of a period, and that is a proper and normative use of the word. So he's saying that's the claim he's making. It is common in Scripture that this expression is used without reference to specific limited times, but he's only talking about that in the first sense, right? And that first normative or proper definition according to the definition of the word until. So let's look at these examples and see if he proves his point.
First, in the narrative of the ark, it was said that the raven did not return until the earth was dried up. Yet the raven did not return even after that limited time.
Okay. Friends, that is an egregiously bad attempt to prove your point. Because we're talking about the flood of Noah. During the flood of Noah, after the flood, Noah would send out a raven and to see if the waters had receded. If the raven returned, he knew that the raven didn't have any place to rest its feet because the waters had not receded, so the raven would return. If the raven didn't return, then that was his sign that the waters had receded. So what is the point that Trent's making here, or what is the point that this person is making? The raven did not return even after the limited time. Yes, it didn't return because that was the whole point of sending it out. What changed? The waters had receded. So we can say without much controversy or deliberation that the word until is used in the first and literal sense. And this first example, used to denote a change in status after a condition is met. What is the condition that was met? The waters receded. I don't even understand the point here. This is, okay, but let's let him try again.
Second, when discussing God, the Scripture says, You are from everlasting to everlasting. But there is no implication here that some limit is being fixed. Rather the opposite.
Yes, rather the opposite. Hence, why it's important to understand idioms. What's the definition of an idiom? A group of words established by usage as having a meaning not deducible from those of the individual words. Okay? From everlasting to everlasting is an idiom. It is not meant to communicate anything about finite time. In fact, the opposite, which is I have to be honest with you. I am really, really flabbergasted that anyone would find any of these arguments convincing. This is, if you accept what he is saying, it is hard for me to understand why it cannot be said without question that you are engaging in motivated reasoning. It's because you want what he's saying to be true. Because you understand the implications that if the Catholic Church has invested all of its eggs into this basket of papal infallibility, and now they've dogmatically determined that this doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity is essential for you to be saved and to be part of the Catholic Church, you have to believe it. Then you've got everything on the line. And even bad arguments will sound to you like good arguments. But this is an egregiously bad argument because there's nothing about from everlasting to everlasting that seems to implicate anything but other than the fact that God is eternal. That's the whole meaning of the phrase. Let's have him try again.
Third, when preaching the gospel beforehand and saying, "In his days my righteousness flourish and peace abound, until the moon be no more," it is not thereby setting a temporal limit to this beautiful part of creation. So then here likewise, it uses the word until to make certain what was before the birth. But
okay, so let's just read that to make sure we understand it. Third, when preaching the gospel beforehand and saying, "In his days may righteousness flourish and peace abound until the moon be no more." Until the moon be no more. Okay? Is there a point at which the moon will be no more? I mean, until the moon be no more. Can we rightly say that this is probably a turn of phrase? Is this an idiomatic use of the word until? I think it's reasonable to say that this is an idiomatic use. When will the moon be no more? Well, the Bible says that in eternity, when God creates a new heaven and a new earth, the moon will be no more because the moon was a great light, according to Genesis, that was created to rule over the night. The great light, the sun, was created to rule over the day, and the moon to rule over the night. Well, there will be no night in heaven, as I understand it. And so what is it saying here? Until the end of the age, where God wraps up and creates a new heaven and a new earth, may righteousness flourish. So once again, what changed? Something changed. Okay, let's remember our definitions here, right? Is it an idiom used to denote the end of a period where a change in status is possible? Well, once God wraps up this earth age, this church age, then there's going to be a whole nother phase. Kind of like when he says, "Lo, I'm with you even until the end of the age." So this is once again precisely the opposite of what Trent thinks is being communicated here. And so he goes on like this a little bit, but I just want to stop here because I think I've gone longer than I intended. Let's understand something, friends. And if there's ever going to be unity, we have to be able to reason together about what is true and what is false. We have to be able to say, we have to set aside motivated reasoning. We have to let the facts fall where they may. If you are one that wants to defend the honor and the so-called supremacy of the Catholic Church, then you're stuck. You've painted yourself into a corner because you cannot allow yourself to be persuaded by the arguments I'm presenting right now, because what's at stake here is that your whole church organization seems to be illegitimate. And what I want to say to you is, friend, that doesn't mean that you're outside of the faith, friend. There is a place where you can land safely and you're not You're not compelled to accept false ideas in order to uphold your status in the church. There are a lot of things that are going to have to unravel. And I know that this is just one element of it. But I think this is a good starting point because the Marian doctrines are a key point of contention. And I think that the way that they are defended tells you a lot about the broader claims of the church, and particularly of Rome, and whether or not they are valid. So I want to pray that you, my friend, my Catholic friend, or you who are kind of in the middle and you don't really know which way you want to go, I want you to ask yourself, are you having to engage in all types of mental gymnastics and cognitive dissonance in order to defend what is the clear teaching of the text, which is that Mary and Joseph had relations because they were married? And that's not even to get into the implications, which I don't have time to go into today, but like, what even is a marriage if it wasn't consummated? I watched a Catholic Father Mike, where he was asked this question, and I don't know the technical definition of this, but Father Mike said that Mary and Joseph were not sacramentally married because they never consummated it, right? It's like, well, what even is a marriage that isn't consummated? Does that even make any sense? It's just like saying you sat down to have dinner, but you didn't eat. Well, if you're sitting in front of the food, but you didn't eat it, then did you have dinner? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Marriage is by definition requires a consummation. So in what sense could it be said that Mary and Joseph were married? This doesn't make any sense. And so I'm just appealing to you, friends, common sense. Here's a bonus question for you. Here's an idiom that I'd like to know if any of you know what it means. Dropping the kids off at the pool. If you say I'm going to drop the kids off at the pool, what does that mean? That's a bonus idiom for the rest of you. But for the rest of you, my friends, I want you to stay with me because I'm going to be doing more videos like this. I'm totally obsessed with this whole thing about the Catholics and Protestants. So I hope you'll go on this journey with me. Leave me a like, a share, a subscribe. Please, I appreciate your support. And until next time, my friends, God bless you.